Because you could have a perfectly executed dish, the lighting could be fantastic, but still there's just something missing. You're like, what is it? Well, it's a possibility it could be having to do with the colors you're using. And so there's a lot that goes into color theory, but I'm gonna help break it down for you. What's shaking, bacon? I'm Joni Simon. Welcome to my studio. This is where I do food photography, and the goal here is to grow your food photography skills so you can feel confident behind the camera. And all month long, we are going to be focusing on the topic of color. This is one of the most important aspects, foundational principles in food photography, because what tells us that a tomato is ripe and what tells us that a cherry is delicious, it has to do with the color. But we're taking it beyond the color wheel that you learned about in elementary school, which I'm sure you're familiar with, because here's the limitation of the color wheel is there are only so many colors represented on it. Whereas when we look at nature and we look at our food, red could be all variety of different shades and hues. And two, what I'm going to help you walk through today is understanding that colors are changed by the presence of other colors around them, that they have a relationship and an interaction with one another. So just to say that red and green go together, well, that's not going to work every single time. We have to understand the deeper context of the color theory underneath that. So how do we even begin to understand colors and the relationships between colors? Well, fortunately, we have Josef Albers to the rescue. If you Google Josef Albers, you'll very quickly find out he was the guy with all the squares, or at least one of the guys with all the squares. There's a lot of guys with a lot of squares. But I remember seeing one of his paintings at the Modern Art Museum and somebody next to me saying, I could paint that. What's the big deal? But like any great artist, there was a method to his madness and the specific area of study that he was pursuing. So now if I put on my art historian hat, Josef Albers was a member of the very famous Bauhaus before then moving to the United States and becoming one of the foremost educators specifically dedicated to the topic of color. And the curriculum that he created, the framework, became the foundation of many of the modern art education programs that we see today. Unfortunately for us, in 1963, he put all of that together into one book called The Subtraction of Color, published by Yale University Press, and is still a helpful resource. If you've been to art school, there is a strong possibility you are already familiar with this book. But here's the thing with this book. It will probably at some point frustrate you, and then the next minute have you completely inspired and curious. Because in terms of his methodology, he did not believe in just providing answers to his students. He was much more about asking questions, inspiring curiosity, and then having students experience color firsthand. Because as I already mentioned, color is incredibly relative, which I think he mentions at least like 20 times in this book. Not only because colors are interacting with one another, but because we're also bringing our own personal experiences to color and our own personal biases. And so by having a student, an artist, interact with color and understand it firsthand, then when you apply the theories, they make that much more sense. So if you don't like getting thrown into the deep end of the pool, this book may not be for you. But if you love to explore and to be curious, I think you're gonna love this. And along those same lines, that's why the first third of this book is all activities based. Before we start talking about theories, which is later on in the book, Josef Albers wants you to start to physically experience the colors and interact with them. But real quick, I just want to define some terms for the purposes of this conversation so that we're, talking the same language. He says on page 34 that any color, whether that's shade or tint, we can refer to that as hue, always has two decisive characteristics. That there is color intensity, which he also refers to as brightness. Some people refer to this as saturation, like how red is that red, and light intensity, which he calls lightness. And that is just the idea of if we have red, how much white is in that red, taking it toward pink, or how much black is in that red, taking it more to the maroons and the burgundies. So now let's hop to one of the activities. This one's on page 20. It's one of my personal favorites. And all of these activities are like little riddles, little mysteries to be solved. If you love puzzles, you're probably going to start to geek out on these. But you want to make sure that you have some way to be able to compare and contrast different colors. And so what I'm using are these color aid papers. If you've been to art school, most likely these were on like your you must buy list or something like that. And then I'm also using my napkins from my props collection. But you could certainly, find swatches of color out of magazines, just cut those out, construction papers. A great place to hit up is your local Home Depot. Score some of those color swatches.
Frisky blue, don't mind if I do.
As long as you have a variety of papers to work with and to compare and contrast, it's going to be a whole lot of fun. So the task with this activity is to have two different colors appear as if they are the same color in terms of hue, saturation, lightness, that they look the same by surrounding them with colors that will influence them to change so that they look similar. And you're like, oh my gosh, how do I do that? Well, part of it is just purely getting in there and starting and messing around and moving things around. And so I ultimately landed on this setup right here. So I've got this yellow napkin, and then I've got this darker blue napkin, and then I've got these two squares, which kind of look like this purpley blue. Well, they kind of look very similar, right? You might be like scrutinizing them and saying, they're slightly different. Well, then if we take those same exact squares and we swap them to the opposite, holy moly, they look completely different. They're very obviously different colors. And then if we overlay them, we see that their similarities kind of, somewhere in the middle. Because the principle at play here is the concept of the subtraction of color. And as he says further down the page, he says that any ground subtracts its own hues from colors which carries and therefore influences. So the idea that the ground, right, the blue, the dark blue, and the yellow are subtracting their own hue from the papers that are placed on top of them. So that paper that's on the yellow is being subtracted from it, making what was kind of more of a blue card look more purple. And then he goes on to say additional experiments with light colors on light backgrounds, dark colors on dark grounds, prove that the light of a ground subtracts in the same way that the hue does. So the idea that that card, even though it was darker than the other card, it appeared lighter because it was on a darker background. We're like, oh, Joni, my mind is bending. And this is why, and I believe wholeheartedly that Josef Albers is correct, you need to experience these things firsthand. So I highly, highly encourage you, don't just watch this video and go, oh, I should put, darker things on darker backgrounds to make them look lighter. Like, go through the experience of practicing these things, because that firsthand experience will inform your color decisions so much better moving forward. But unfortunately, there's no shortcuts with this. Like, you just have to get in and do the work. And hopefully you're excited about this and you find yourself curious, and then it's okay to lose hours playing with little swatches of paper of different colors to see the magic that's revealed in this activity and all the other activities that are in this book. But now we need to bring it back down to planet Earth to get some practical application, because you might be wondering, like, how does this really impact food photography? Well, it's huge, right? Just in terms of the color of the food, and how is that interacting in terms of the props and the napkins and the backdrops that you're setting? How is that impacting your food? So let's use some waffles as an example. Now, what's the primary color that's in these waffles? Not just the primary versus secondary, but what's the main color that's in these waffles, which actually is also a primary color, is yellow. Now, there's of course some oranges and some reds in there as well, but mostly dealing with yellow. And so if we take that waffle and place it on like kind of a greenish yellow, like olive background, what's that going to do to the color of the waffle? Well, first of all, because the presence of green, we talked about this in that previous exercise, that the green is going to be subtracted out of that waffle, right? From the ground, it's going to subtract out of the waffle. And so the idea that then the opposite of green, it's going to push it more red. So any reds that are present in that waffle are going to be more apparent than they would be otherwise. And two, that green has a lot of yellow in it, right? We look at any given color on a spectrum, right? Green can go from yellow green up to blue green. And so this has a lot of yellows in it. And so again, going back to that subtractive method, the idea that the yellows then are being subtracted from that waffle. And so when the yellows are subtracted, then its opposite color on the color wheel, which is purple, is being added in. Well, we're adding purple into yellow, and that suddenly gives us what? That gives us brown and flat and murky and not exciting, right? And so while I love that olive green for other applications, it's not going to be the most suitable pairing for this particular waffle. So what's a better option then in terms of color to pair with this yellow if we really want to make it explode off the screen, grab people in the eyeballs? Well, we think about what's opposite of yellow. If we can intensify that yellow, we're going to use purple. Something in that more purpley tone is going to subtract the purple out of the waffle, intensifying the yellow and helping to elevate that. But now don't just pick any purple and expect it to work. You can be even more methodical about the process by, again, taking into consideration what is the saturation, that brightness aspect as Albers refers to it, or the lightness, or how dark or light is that particular purple that we're going to pair with it. So we go back to the waffle and we understand that it's a, relatively saturated yellow. It's not super intense, but it's also not super dull, and that it's a rather light yellow, not really dark yellow. So now if we want to capitalize on the lightness of that waffle, right? It's a light yellow. If we want to make that light feel even lighter, then understanding that a purple, we're not going to necessarily want a light purple, because a light purple will make it appear darker because it's subtracting itself out, right? A light purple will pull the lightness out of the waffle, make it appear darker. So if we use a darker purple, that is going to subtract the darkness out of that waffle and make it lighter. And now in case you don't have like an inexhaustible supply of various napkins and backgrounds, well, that's when our friend Lightroom comes into play and we start to play with those HSL sliders. And this is where you have a lot of control to understand, well, how bright do I want that purple to be? How light do I want that purple to be? How more towards the reds or more towards the blues, depending on the other colors that are present in the image.
Beachside Drive. You're coming home with me.